Today's topic is hotel kashering, and we'll talk about how to kasher different pieces of equipment that are common, like hotels and other like food service type locations. It's based on a presentation about this, given that I gave together with Rabbi Avram Stone from the OU back in 2009 for an ACOVAD conference, and we're going to focus in today about just the ones that are specific to commercial accounts like hotels, but there are other things like things that are like ovens, sinks, the stovetop, and things like that, which are give or take the same as you'd find in a regular kitchen. Is not going to be for today. We'll do that some other time when we just do regular kitchen kashering. Their sink and my sink at home are the same. Maybe give or take the same thing. We did once speak about commercial dishwashers. Excuse me, that's different than a home dishwasher, but we spoke about that also separately, so we're not going to do that again today. Today we're going to talk about a handful of things that are particular to commercial food service, hotel-type kitchens. But before we get to the actual details of the kasherings themselves, I'm going to say over some points that Rabbi Stone made, specifically about safety, where these are actually different because in this type of a setting, safety is even more of a concern. And that is that like this. Some of these procedures that we're going to see, that we're going to talk about, are a little more intense than what you do in your house. And a person really should be done by somebody with experience who knows what he's doing. And overall, kashering in general, but in particular, some of the ways we're going to talk about, could be dangerous. And that means to say people have been burned by boiling water that's scalded them, or if they use coals or flames or torches or leftover heat when they finished the kashering and something was still hot, and a person has to be extra careful. And then you have to take lots of precautions when setting up a kashering, and a person slipping when they're carrying a pot of boiling water or opening up a piece of foil that's covering something that's boiling hot, in his words, can have lifelong consequences. So a person really has to be careful. Now, from a different angle, the equipment in these types of kitchens is very expensive. And putting them through what it takes to kasher them sometimes is going to be beyond the normal limits of what the equipment is meant to handle. If there was damage was going to be done, that would be something the mashgiach or the Hashgachah might even be held responsible for that. So because of that, a person should only do that. Only should kasher when he has another reason why. A person should only kasher if he has experience and knows what he's doing and understands how much the equipment can handle and how much it cannot handle, so he can treat it appropriately. Okay, now a couple of rules here about kashering. The first is never to leave a flame or coals that are not being washed even for a minute. Too dangerous, of who knows what could happen, to never walk away from that. Second is never rush kashering. It doesn't make a difference how hectic things are or how late you're running. Everything has to be careful, thought out, and deliberate, so we don't make mistakes. Next, never wear loose-fitting clothing or shoes that can slip when you're on a wet surface. Always be cautious when you make judgments about something, and if you're not sure about something, err on the side of caution and safety. If you think that it might be too hot, or you're working, this equipment really can't handle this, you're probably right and you shouldn't be doing it. Always pay attention to what you're doing, focus on what you're trying to accomplish, and don't get distracted by talking to somebody, looking at your phone and things like that. And last is to always have things like fire extinguishers nearby in case something goes wrong, that you should be prepared to deal with emergencies or things that didn't happen the way you expect them to do. Okay, now, our first piece of equipment that we're going to talk about is a flat top. What is a flat top? Literally, it looks like a flat piece of stainless steel. That's what it looks like. It's a large cooking surface, a griddle. Usually, it's like 2-3 feet wide and 2-3 feet like long, and it's heated by like gas or electric that are underneath the griddle, and use it for frying or broiling foods. And it literally, when you look in the kitchen, just a flat surface that's there, but of course it gets very hot and it's used for cooking. So there's two halachic issues to think about in deciding which way to kasher the flat top. The first is like this. The Shulchan Aruch said that there's something called the machvas, and he says it's a pan that you cook you cook with it with oil, and he says you could kasher it with Hagala, and there's a little bit of a discussion of exactly which thing that applies to, but it's accepted. What Ramosha says, that we assume that for most isurim you could kasher with you could use Hagala to kasher this thing called whatever that thing is. It's called the machvas. Now the Mishabura says that a machvas, which in modern Hebrew we call it a frying pan, but the Mishabura says that a frying pan that you just grease with oil or fat or butter is not the machvas. That's not the machvas that the Shulchan Aruch was talking about. That one, for sure, in that case, the food had direct contact with the kli that was right over the fire, and you would need liban gomer. So the Shulchan Aruch is only talking about is only the Shulchan Aruch's machvas is the one that's used with much more oil than this frying pan that the Mishabura describes. Now, so there are two different ways to understand what the Mishabura was talking about. I mean, the Mishabura is telling us that machvas that the Shulchan Aruch said, which uses oil and could be kashed with Hagala, is not the frying pan that I use, that I just put some oil or butter or animal fat on it as the way to grease it. Okay, and that one needs liba. Okay, so Rubelsky said that the Mishabura's case was the amount of oil somebody could put in at home, like if you're frying pancakes. And that's the kind of case that the Mishabura said needs libun, and the only case where the machvas where we could be makel is like a deep fryer or a pot where you use a lot of oil or water inside of it. Okay, now according to that way of looking at it, then the flat top needs liban gomer, because it's usually you often put onto it eggs and hash browns and other things with a minimal amount of oil. And Rebelsky is saying is that minimal amount of oil is what the Mishabura was describing as the case that for sure needs liban gomer. That's how Rebelsky read it. Rav Schwartz did not agree with that. He said the Mishabura is only being machmir in cases where you use such a tiny amount. In the way he described from like how people used to do it was they would rub a stick of butter across a pan before they started frying. That's how people used to do it. The modern version of that is spraying a pan with Pam, just to get a tiny coating of oil on it. Okay, he says that's the case where the Mishabura said that you need libun. He says, but if you use a little more oil, anything more than that, like as if you pour it from a bottle, use a little more oil than that, then that's the machvas that the Shulchan Aruch was talking about, and you don't need liban gomer. Now, in a commercial kitchen, the typical use is with the kind of oil that Schwartz says would be qualified as a machvas. Again, not Rebelsky. Rebelsky would have said that those are the case that the Mishabura is being machmir on, but the way Schwartz is reading it, the amount of oil you use in a commercial kitchen, they don't spray just Pam onto it. They use more meaningful amounts of oil, would be enough to qualify as the machvas where you could get away with Hagala. That's our first issue we have to think about. The second is that even within where Schwartz said it, it's true that that's the bulk of the uses will be with enough oil to qualify as a machvas where Hagala would work. He says, but for sure there will be times when they're going to use it with no oil at all, or with the amount like the pan amount of oil. Well, they'll just throw a piece of meat onto the thing without any oil onto it at all. So here we have a piece of equipment, this machvas, that has the main use is a way that only needs Hagala, according to Schwartz, Hagala or liban kal, but occasionally use it in a way that needs liban gomer. So what happens in that case? How do you kasher it? So the Shulchan Aruch says that as long as the kli is ein ben yom, as long as you haven't used it in 24 hours, you only have to think about roiv tashmishay, the main way that you used it, and you could ignore the miyat tashmishay, the occasional way that you use it, and you could just kasher based on roiv tashmishay. The Ramah says no. The Ashkenazim are machmir and say you have to be choshesh even for miyat tashmishay. So if we stop at this point, we would say, as the Ramah says, is that we would need to kasher this with liban gomer, because occasionally you use it, even according to our Schwartz, occasionally it'll be used in ways that needs liban gomer. However, the Ramah himself is makel on a couple of cases. He says, first of all, in cases of b'diavad, and maybe there will be cases of shasachak b'diavad. Okay, you could be makel on fal roiv tashmishay. Or there's another case, which is what happens if the following miyat tashmishay means is you won't be able to kasher this kli at all. Like in a case where you need liban gomer and the kli can't handle liban gomer, then also you could go with ikar adin that miyat tashmishay, you could follow miyat tashmishay. There's also this is sort of like an aside, that there's a good reasoning based. It's a kiveger to say that even the Ramah is makel To follow Rav Tashmisha, if two things come in conjunction, one is we're talking about kashering from chametz to be used something on Pesach, and the second is that the Miyat Tashmisha would say do libun, like in our case, like with the flat top. Okay, that's a different question. That it could be there's an extra kula for Pesach. The Rambam would be making for Pesach, and if it's to follow Miyat Tashmisha, if just a question of libun. Okay, but anyhow, so what we've seen is that the according to Rebelsky, seemingly it should for sure need Lieben Gomer. According to Schwartz, most of its use is for a way that needs Hagala. Occasional use is a way that needs Libun. And then we have a question of, should we kasher based on Miyat Tashmisha? Right, we should be kashering from Miyat Tashmisha, unless that would be impossible, in which case it could be Samech on Rav Tashmisha. So with this, pulling all this together now, what Schwartz said was, we should preferably kasher with Lieben Gomer if we have a choice, because that is the Miyat Tashmisha. But if it's not possible, then Lieben Kal is good enough also. Now, we spoke about once in the past that when we kasher with Lieben Kal, we need to make sure that the fire is on the side of the kli where the food was. Not necessarily where the fire was, but where the food was. Now, on the flat top, if we would just turn on the flames, or the coils that are on it, those flames are under the flat top. So it's coming from the, so to speak, wrong side of the kli. We need to have our heat be on the top, on the place where the food is. So turning on the flat top is not going to do the trick. That's not going to do Lieben Kal. Rather, what we do is you put a very thin layer of coal on over the entire surface of the flat top. It doesn't need to be a lot, just a thin layer if you don't light them up. Lighting up the coals and letting them burn will create Lieben Kal. And if you leave them long enough, you may even be able to accomplish Lieben Gomer also. And that's where we kasher the flat top. Okay, let's move on to our next piece of equipment, a tilt skillet. And that is, what's a tilt skillet? Otherwise known as a brazier. It looks like a big, like a rectangular pot, also a couple of feet, 2-3 feet wide and maybe 2 feet across. But the pot is only like 8-12 inches deep. It sits usually on a base. It always sits on a base, meaning so there's a base that holds it up off the ground. So the base is a couple of feet high, and it's attached to that base on just one side, on the front side. The part, I mean, imagine if you're standing in front of the tilt skillet, the part that's closest to you on the front has a hinge on it. And what the point is, what you can do is when the food, you cook your food in this tilt skillet, and when you finish your cooking, you can lift up the tilt skillet from the back, and which makes it tilt forwards towards the person standing in front of it, and that way you can pour the food out of the tilt skillet into your serving dishes or your other containers or something like that. Okay, and the front usually will have like a spout to it also to even make it easier to pour to get the food out, and because it tilts, that's called a tilt skillet. Okay, so it's a skillet. It's a way of cooking, but it has a tilting feature that helps it tilt forward to help get the food out from afterwards. Now, in most places, the main thing you do with a tilt skillet is you cook food. Remember, it has a high wall. 8-12 inches high. So you use it for soup or rice. You use it for things that use lots of water or oil in them. But occasionally, people will fry in it without oil also. They just use it as a skillet. It's basically just a hot surface that they could just cook on. So again, this is an example of something where Rav Tashmisha is for ways that need Hagala with liquids, but Miyat Tashmisha is for Lieben Gomer. So, as I said before, by the flat top, if it's possible, you should do Lieben. You should do Lieben, which is again by putting a layer of coals onto the surface, allowing them to burn. Or if that's not possible, then we follow Rav Tashmisha and you do Hagala, which fill it with water and bring it to a boil, which is fine. It's built for that. It's made to fill up with water and bring it to a boil. So the main part of the tilt skillet we can kash like that. Now, that's just helping us for the bottom and maybe some of the walls. But we also have to make sure we kasher all the walls, the spout, and the cover, which is a little complication over here. So if we kasher it with coals, if we do that method, then and you put the cover maybe 3/4 of the way closed, so what will happen is air will get in to keep the coals burning, but the enough heat's going to stay inside that all the parts of the tilt skillet seemingly will get kashered well enough just by the heat of that coal sitting there on the bottom. The exception to that rule is that there's a part on the outside of the place where the cover attaches to the pot. Okay, it'll be in the back of the tilt skillet. There's a seam. There's a place where there's like a hinge, a seam where the cover attaches to the back of the cover of the tilt skillet attaches to the back of the tilt skillet. So this is the cover attaching to the body, like to the pot part of it. And there, food ends up getting caught in there. Food and grease get stuck into there, and you need to put a coal, or some people use a torch, to burn out all the grease out of there, and the food that gets stuck behind here. So aside from the coals on the inside that will heat everything up well enough to kasher it, you also need to do something before you do all this kashering. You need to get rid of all the be'en, all the grease and residue that's left inside of that, inside that seam. Now, if you're kashering with water, then of course you have to do the seam also. That's not going to change. But you also have to make sure that this boiling water gets every place. So so what our complications is, we need to get the water up to the very top of the walls, and also high enough. Remember, if there's a spout, that means there's a part of the wall that doesn't hold water as well. So what you do is, just because the water would pour out of it. So what you do is, some people will, if it's possible, actually lean the skillet backwards and forwards. So tip the whole thing a little forwards and a little backwards. Backwards and forwards to help get water all over the place. Or you can overflow the skillet by getting, what you do is you put a separate pot of water up to boil someplace on a different fire, and then lower that pot into overflow, like with any other large pot. Now, both of those things that I just described are going to cause boiling water to be pouring onto the floor, so you have to be extra careful about your safety at that point, because boiling water is boiling water. It's dangerous. You could slip, but of course it could burn the person itself also, so a person has to be extra careful if they're going to actually do something like that. Now, as far as the cover is concerned, if you're kashering with water instead of with coals, then in some cases you can unscrew and remove the cover from the rest of the tilt skillet and kasher it by just dunking it into the boiling water itself. When the water's ready boiling, you don't have to kasher it all at once, so you could just do one side and then do the other side. If that's not possible, then you would want the water to boil in the tilt skillet for long enough that the entire underside of the cover is going to be covered with water, and then that will be the water that will be the kasha. Okay, let's move on to something else now. Our third thing, that is a steam kettle. So a steam kettle is really just looks like a big pot, but what's unusual about it is that it has a double wall. And so there's a double layered wall, and steam passes through the cavity between those two layers. So we call that a jacket or a steam jacket. Okay, so you made this extra space in there where steam can flow. Now, as far as Hilchos Shabbos and Blias, this steam kettle is considered to be on the fire. So for Shabbos, as it relates to Chazara, it's considered to be on the fire. As far as Blias, it's considered a klirishim. But as far as deciding whether something needs libun or hagala, where there being on the fire is one of the conditions to something that needs libun, this is not considered to be on the fire. That we only give that status when something is heated by a flame, by a flame or an electric coil. But just being heated by steam is not enough, does not make it be considered onto the fire. So therefore, libun gomer would never be required for the steam kettle. You catch them with hagala, so you fill them with water and bring it to a boil, like pretty standard. And just make sure you do things like overflowing it to make sure water gets all the surfaces and to the cover. Now, that steam that heats the kettle could either be made right at the kettle. Some of them have just a self-contained little heating system to heat up water to turn into steam to heat up the steam kettle. Or in other cases, it's made in the boiler that services the whole hotel, all the kitchens and all kinds of things that it services. Now, Tam transfers from the kettle into the steam and vice versa. And therefore, as a prerequisite to kashering the steam kettle, you have to drain the steam and the condensate from the jacket or from the boiler and replace it with kosher water. If that water is coming from a central boiler, then not only do you have to get rid of the non-kosher water that's in there, you also have to make sure that boiler is not being used for non-kosher at the same time. I mean, if you're in the first kitchen and you've kashered your kitchen and you drained the boiler and kashered it, but there's another kitchen which is making treif, then you haven't solved your problem because your steam is still going to get non-kosher bleeds from that kitchen. So you have to pay attention that not only are you getting rid of the non-kosher water from the boiler, from the central boiler, but you're also making sure it's not working for a non-kosher event at the same time. Okay, and now a vegetable steamer is a little bit different. It's very different from that, and there all the blias happen through steam without any liquid, and therefore you can kasher the steamer itself with steam also. Usually we don't kasher things with steam because that's a gas. We only kasher with liquid, with water. But here's an exception, because since the blia happened through steam, so Kabbalah Kachpote tells us that we can kasher with steam also. Again, as I mentioned a minute ago about the steam kettle, if this steam is coming from a central boiler, that services the whole hotel, you have to take care of that steam just like you did with the steam kettle. Now, the pans that are in the vegetable steamer, if that's all they do is vegetable steamer, you can kasher them that way also. But if they get put into the oven, if they're pans that get put into the oven, then they will need Hagala if there's always liquids with them, or sometimes they even need libun if people put dry food, like they put, pile up some meat and stick it into the oven just to warm up or to keep it warm, then they might need libun also. Okay, and our last thing we're going to talk about is a hot box, which is basically a big box, and it's insulated, and it's meant for putting pans or plates of food into it, either to keep them warm or to heat them up further at these kind of events. So the rule is that we only need to do libun when there's when the food has direct contact with the surface that became treif. But if there's air or liquid in between them, then you do not have to do libun. Then the most you'd have to do is hagol. So, like in a grill, you put the meat right onto the rack. You grill the meat right onto the racks, and therefore those need libun gomer. But in a hot box, no food touches the walls of the hot box or even the racks that the food on. It's always in a pan or on a plate or something like that. So the way time transfers is through air or through zeya, passing from the food into the chamber and vice versa. And therefore, you do not need to do libun gomer to the hot box. In theory, you would be able to kasher with hagala, but that's not so practical. So in practice, what people do is they use sterno. Those are like the fuel cans that are used for chafing dishes. And it works like this. So first is to get started, to get ready, you have to take all the shelves out, clean them, and clean the whole hot box. That's not such an easy job. Sometimes there's a heating box on the bottom, and that with holes in it where food falls into it. So you have to clean that out and make sure that that's really clean. Okay, then, of course, don't use everything for 24 hours. I should have said that beforehand, that all this equipment needs to be wait 24 hours before you kasher it. Wonderful. Now, how do you kasher it? So what you're going to do is you're going to put in a certain amount of sternos. I'll tell you how many in a second. You put in a certain amount of sternos. You should use only the sternos that are fueled by ethanol or methanol. Those are two kinds of fuels that give more heat, as opposed to the ones that give a different kind of fuel, the liquid fuel called diethylene glycol. That's we should not use. So you put the sternos into the hot box, 2 or 3 of them near the door, and the rest of them wherever you want. And once you light them, then you close the door of the hot box. Either you close it very tightly if there's no gasket, because we know air will get in anyhow. But if there is a gasket, then leave it open and drop so that a little bit of air can get in, or else the sternos will go out. Then you turn on the hot box, its own heat, to add to the heat that's going on there, and you let it burn for as long as it goes. Usually it's about 2 hours, and that will then you let it burn. Of course, don't open the door till it cools off, because it'll be very hot inside there, and then it'll be kasher. Now, just to talk about how many sternos you need, depends on the box. I'm going to read off. It's here. I have it here in front of me in a chart. And like this. I'm going to just go through the numbers quickly. For each of these, I'm going to tell you how many sternos to use. How many sternos to use if you have an ethanol sternos. The methanol uses a drop more for each one of these cases. Okay, but I'll just do the ethanol ones rather than just reading everything off. Okay, so it depends really on the size, how many cubic inches there are in the hot box, and of course the cubic inches you find out, you times the length times the width times the height, and so you know if it's this many inches across and this many inches deep and this many inches high, you multiply them together and you get to an amount. So what it goes is this: what they call a half upright, which is less than 20,000 cubic inches, would be 3 ethanol sternos. A full upright, which is 20 to 40,000 cubic inches, would use 6 sternos. Okay, now I have 4 other ones where I just call a small, medium, like that. So a small hot box is under 60,000 cubic inches, would have 7 sternos. A medium, which is between 60 and 70,000 cubic inches, would use 8 sternos. A large one from 70 to 80,000 dollars is, I'm sorry, not dollars, 70 to 80,000 cubic inches. Excuse me, it has 9 sternos. And an extra large one, which is more than 80,000 cubic inches, we get 10 sternos. Again, all those numbers I gave are for ethanol sternos. The methanols give a little bit less heat, so they need a little bit. Each one of them needs 1 or 2 more based on the sizes.